This morning, we have the ability to continue our election post-mortem discussions. And I have the pleasure of sitting in studio with no other than former Assemblyman and former Minority Leader of the THA, Mr. Ashworth. Jack, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Shenell. Good morning, Tobago, and all the persons who are listening and viewing on the World Wide Web. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be able to have this interaction with you.
Right. And as we have this post-mortem discussion, the question everyone in Tobago is now asking, now that we have elected two what persons may deem independent representatives from Tobago that are separate and apart from the two leading parties or main political entities in the country, being the UNC and the PNM, what type of true power does Tobago now have, being that they are not connected to any one of these key entities?
Well, I'm glad that is the question that has been asked. But let me first clear this up. Those two people are not independent. They are members of the TPP. It's a minority party in the House. There are three parties in the House. The government, which is the UNC, the main opposition party, which is the PNM, and a minority party that has two votes, which is Tobago, which in this case is the TPP. It's not a unique situation. It has happened before in the days of the DSC, and so we see that we come in full circle. What I am hoping that what happened in 76 to 91, 76 to 81, sorry, could happen again, where the two seats in the parliament was able to bring meaningful change. I've heard the argument, and I think sometimes you listen to some people and you listen to some of the arguments, and the people who are making the arguments, and you know it is not genuine. And let me explain. In the run-up to the elections of 2024, or 25, sorry, the 28th of April 25, the biggest claim that the PNM was making, in fact it was their campaign cry, is that a vote for the TPP is a vote for the UNC. And now they're saying, you see, they're not in cabinet. But I know that was a trap to say immediately after the election. You see what I tell you? They was going to give the two seats. But that being said, I think what happened is that there are a number of things that we have to depend on here. Yeah, and I just overheard something that you said in the news item about Dr. James speaking about relationships. And Tobago have always had to depend on relationships in order to get anything it needed. And that is why the issue here is relationships vis-a-vis legislative responsibility. And so from 1977 to now, there have been an attempt by Tobagoans to change having to depend on a relationship and having legislative responsibility, because legislative responsibility is more predictable, more concrete than relationship with dependent on personalities and stuff like that. And so one might ask oneself, and I'm hearing the question because I've been called and asked it a couple of times, how does Tobago fare without having ministers in the cabinet? And if people understood the thrust for internal self-government and some of the devolution of powers, the intent was to have Tobago step away from having to depend on ministers in the government. And let me explain. The fifth schedule of the Tobago House of Assembly is supposed to give Tobago about 75% of the responsibilities for the development of Tobago. And therefore, none of those should be the responsibility of any cabinet, regardless of which government is in power. Unfortunately, there have been some missteps in that regard, where some of the legislations that went before Act Number 40 and 1996 came into being, that allow ministers to do like town and country planning is a case in point. It is the responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly. But even prior to 1996, the government, I think Dr. Rowley was then Minister of Planning. They took a legislation back to the Parliament to do some changes to Town and Country. And one of the simple things that should have been done is to simply say that in the case of Tobago, the Tobago House of Assembly have responsibility for Town and Country planning. In the case of Tobago, where you have an appeal, that appeal goes to the Secretary for Planning and not to the Minister of Planning. Those things were not done. And so what I am hoping that this dispensation will do is to look at those pieces of legislation that directly impact on the delivery of service in Tobago and to do whatever is necessary to ensure that ministers does not have that responsibility in any way. Because I remember hearing Minister Kojo, former Minister Kojo, saying that Drill was bold to say that she couldn't do certain things in sports and things in Tobago. Drill was not bold. Drill was following the law. It happened that Minister Kojo was Minister of Sports, and as a result of that, there are certain things that she could have delivered. But that is not the way the law is set up. The law gives sports a fifth schedule item. And any money spent in sports should really be spent by the Tobago House of Assembly under the division responsible for sports. That being said, once you have a situation where the relationship and the legislative agenda is correct, there is no need for a minister on anything under the fifth schedule. And then one might ask himself, what about the 6 and 7 schedule? But the 6 and 7 schedule clearly points out that where the government is to deliver service in Tobago, that it may enter into a MOU with the Tobago House of Assembly. So one way or the other, there is no need for ministerial intervention in Tobago. Of course, that is except the judiciary and the office of the president. So those are the only two areas, and the judiciary does not necessarily fall under a ministry because there are 3 arms of government.
Understood. But there are persons who have raised the fact that in the last Kamala Prasad
administration
led government, there was a Ministry of Tobago Development.
Right.
How come we didn't see something like that being formed again this time? And do you think that would have been in the best interest of Tobago?
I think that maybe what this is telling us is that the government is saying that it is time to put all the things in place to make Tobago be able to make a lawmaking, policy formation, implementation body, the Tobago House of Assembly. And in that way, maybe all you need is proper coordination between the THA and the central government. And maybe there might have been some mistakes made in the 2010-2015. I was a part of that administration, and there might have been some mistakes made and some lessons learned, and say, listen, allow Tobago a lot more latitude in some of these matters and try to give Tobago the autonomy that it deserves, so that you take all this away. I know that there are some things that the CAS still have to do in terms of the monies that still have to pass through CAS and all that, but you don't necessarily need a whole ministry for it. And I'm hoping that if it is needed at all, it would be a temporary measure.
Okay. And does that in any way prohibit the Tobago House of Assembly from seeking internal self-government? Because you hear some person saying, well, our main focus at this point in time is to get that Tobago autonomy secured. However, does having a Ministry of Tobago Development or even greater work happening at CAS prohibit that pursuit of autonomy?
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't at all. There's nothing that prevents Tobago from seeking autonomy, but there's no need for greater work at CAS, as I was explaining. When you say greater work, I mean matters under the 5th and 6th schedule. That's basically the only thing CAS is responsible for. And I think that the fact that there's not a Ministry of Tobago Development tells me that the government is probably going to look at the letter of the law and says, if these things are to be delivered in Tobago, then we could enter into the necessary MOUs. Some of the things that we saw in the last 10 years or so, where there was actually a clawing back of responsibilities from the Tobago House of Assembly. Now, for example, the construction of the airport. wharves and airports are the responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly. And there could have been a MOU that allowed that to happen. So a lot of things that we think is natural to the government of Trinidad and Tobago based in Trinidad really could be dealt with differently. But that have a lot to do with the quality of relationships and the speed at which the legislation is passed to give Tobago undeniable. There should be no ambiguity as to who have responsibility for what in the space. And that as long as ministers can override stuff that happen in the country, this will be an issue, and places like the Ministry of Tobago Development could be put up without any challenge at all.
Okay. And for you, as it pertains to the relationship, what do you think outside of the Tobago Autonomy Bill that has been deemed by this administration to be their number one focus? But there are other areas that need to be adjusted as it pertains to the allocation to the THA that can be done outside of a bill being passed in Parliament. And we heard the Prime Minister saying that there are interim measures that can take place to improve the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago without the bill, because the bill is not going to be passed tomorrow. So as it pertains to those things, can we see a greater level of approvals as it pertains to non-objection letters coming from the Minister of Finance? And what are some of the other areas that can help the THA function more smoothly just because of the enhanced relationship?
I'm convinced that that there's already ongoing talks in that regard. And I'm convinced that there are things that will be done differently. There are some things that I am not at liberty to say, and I'm quite sure you will understand that. Mm-hmm. I'm not at liberty to mention some of these things, but I know that what Tobago should be looking for in a first instance is an increase in its allocation in the first instance in the present iteration of the Act to reflect the population size, which is what was used in the Dispute Resolution Commission. And that will immediately give Tobago a bump in its allocation and therefore its ability to deliver stuff as it comes to Tobago. As far as the non-objection letters and stuff like that, I feel very confident. You know, as I said, I'm not at liberty to speak some stuff, but I feel very, very confident that that is going to be something that will be done very easily, because it doesn't take anything from Trinidad to do a non-objection letter. Again, it comes back to the relationship as it relates to autonomy. If Tobago was a lawmaking body and stuff like that, then you would not have needed a minister to issue a non-objection letter. The minister in Tobago with responsibility for those things would have been able, in this case I think it's planning, would have been able to just simply do a non-objection letter. These are maybe in the last couple of years, because of the amount of things that have happened that kept Tobago's progress back and took back so much of the responsibility. It might have been a blessing in disguise so that there's a clearer picture as to what should be dealt with to deal with Tobago's share of the budget, the autonomy, the things that we should be able to do in Tobago without interference from a cabinet in Trinidad. And I know that every administration, because when the previous administration was elected, I am sure there was high hopes, because they say we have a Tobago Prime Minister, 2 Tobago MPs who are ministers, basically, and there was high hopes that, some of these things will be done. But what we saw was a jockeying for political position in the space that says, my organization, I could use my power to advance the cause of my organization, not necessarily advance the cause of the people of Tobago. And I think that is one of the things that we have to guard against. We have to guard against relationships that says that the organization is paramount to the people of Tobago.
Understood. But even as it pertains to those discussions and some of those negotiations, and you said you are not at liberty to disclose certain things that you are aware of, but do you believe there should be a certain level of transparency as it pertains to how this administration communicates with the central government.
Of course it must be.
For example, may possibly a press conference coming after those discussions stating that now that the Prime Minister has been installed, the THA has had those discussions and this is the way that we would be moving forward. Do you think that the public should also have a certain level of input on what we want to see as this relationship evolves?
Okay, let me talk first about the transparency and then speak about the public input. In terms of the issue of transparency, I am quite sure that once all those agreements are drilled down, there will be, because it is going to be a reason for boasting. And therefore, any politician who doesn't take the opportunity to tout their successes isn't worth the salt. And I don't think that we can say that of the President and Chief Secretary. I'm quite sure he will be more than willing, more than elated to say, this is what we have benefited as a result of our negotiations. One. I think the second question had to do with public involvement. If we have to be very careful to what level we need public involvement, because public involvement can take years. Because everybody say, you didn't consult with us, we wanted more than 5%, there's no justification. And so what you have to do is that you have to, there are some things that the public have elected you to do. But when it's finished, you have to be able to level with the public and say, this is what we have done, this is why we have done this, and this is the result of that. It all comes back in the same basket, really.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break right here, and we'll be back right after this, so see you soon.